The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd, 3 women stood out not for their respectful admiration but for their loud complaints and dismissive attitudes toward the ancient traditions they were witnessing. Sarah Mitchell, a wealthy socialite from New York, adjusted her designer sunglasses and scrolled through her phone with obvious boredom. At 42, she was accustomed to getting her way in every situation, whether through her family's money or her aggressive personality. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against her Louis Vuitton handbag as she surveyed the scene. With disdain. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she announced loudly to her companions, making sure her voice carried to the other tourists nearby. "We've been standing here for 20 minutes and nothing interesting has happened. These guards just stand there like statues. What's the point?" Her friend, Jessica Wong, a successful lawyer from Los Angeles, nodded in agreement while checking her expensive watch. At 38, Jessica had built her career on intimidating opponents and never backing down from a fight. She had the same entitled air as Sarah, believing that her professional success gave her the right to criticize anything she deemed beneath her standards. "I don't understand why people make such a big deal about this," Jessica said, her voice dripping with contempt. "It's just grown men playing dress-up in ridiculous outfits. We could be shopping on Oxford Street instead of wasting our time watching this medieval nonsense." The third woman, Amanda Torres, a social media influencer from Miami with over 2 million followers, was busy taking selfies while completely ignoring the historical significance of what was happening around her. At 29, Amanda lived her entire life for the camera, believing that everything existed solely for her content creation. She had come to London not to appreciate the culture, but to add exotic locations to her Instagram feed. "The lighting is terrible here," Amanda complained, holding up her phone at various angles. "How am I supposed to get good content when these boring guards won't even smile or interact with me? Don't they know who I am? My last post got 3 million views." The 3 women had met at their luxury hotel the previous evening and quickly bonded over their shared sense of superiority and entitlement. They had planned their London trip as a quick getaway, expecting the city to cater to their every whim, just as their home cities did. However, they were quickly discovering that British traditions and protocols didn't bend to accommodate their demanding personalities. As they continued their loud commentary, other tourists began to notice their disrespectful behavior. Families with children moved away from them. Elderly couples shook their heads in disapproval, and even other international visitors seemed embarrassed by their conduct. But the 3 women were completely oblivious to the negative attention they were attracting. The royal guards standing at their posts remained perfectly still, their famous red tunics and tall bearskin hats creating an impressive display of discipline and tradition. These were not mere ceremonial figures, as the women assumed, but highly trained soldiers who had served in active combat zones around the world. Their stoic expressions and unwavering stance were the result of years of rigorous training and deep respect for their duties. Sergeant James Morrison, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, stood at the main gate with his rifle at the present arms position. At 35, he had seen real combat and understood the weight of responsibility that came with guarding the monarchy. His dark eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but his ears picked up every word of the women's disrespectful chatter. Years of military discipline kept his face expressionless, but inside, his patience was being tested. Corporal William Hayes, positioned near the palace entrance, was a decorated soldier who had served in Iraq and Bosnia. At 28, he had joined the Royal Guard as the pinnacle of his military career, taking immense pride in the honor and tradition of his position. The women's mockery of his uniform and duties struck at the core of everything he held sacred about his service to Queen and country. "Look at them," Sarah continued her critique, pointing directly at Sergeant Morrison. "They can't even move or speak. What kind of job is that? I bet they're not even real soldiers. Probably just actors hired to look impressive for the tourists." Jessica laughed at her friend's comment, encouraging her to continue. "You're probably right. Real soldiers would have better things to do than stand around all day looking pretty. This is probably just some government jobs program for people who can't find real work." Amanda finally lowered her phone and joined the conversation. I tried to get one of them to pose with me earlier, but he completely ignored me. How rude is that? Don't they understand that my followers would love to see content with authentic British guards? I'm basically giving them free publicity. Their voices grew louder and more obnoxious as they fed off each other's energy. What had started as casual complaints was escalating into open mockery and disrespect. Other tourists were now actively avoiding their area, creating a bubble of space around the three women as they continued their tirade. The palace staff members observing from nearby positions exchanged concerned glances. They had dealt with difficult tourists before, but the level of disrespect these women were showing was unusual even by their standards. Protocol required them to maintain professional composure unless the situation escalated to a point where intervention became necessary. As the morning progressed, the women's behavior became increasingly bold. They seemed to interpret the guards' silence as weakness rather than discipline, not understanding that they were pushing against centuries of military tradition and personal honor. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would teach them a harsh lesson about respect and the consequences of their entitled behavior. The other tourists continued to watch nervously, sensing that something was about to happen, but unable to predict exactly what form it would take. The ancient stones of Buckingham Palace had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout history, and they were about to witness another as three entitled women prepared to learn that some boundaries should never be crossed. The situation began to escalate when Amanda decided that the guards' professional silence was actually a challenge to her social media influence. She had built her entire career on getting reactions from people and situations, and the stoic demeanor of the royal guards represented a puzzle she was determined to solve, regardless of the appropriateness of her methods. "Watch this," Amanda announced to her companions, pulling out her phone and opening her live streaming app. Within seconds, thousands of her followers were watching as she approached the rope barriers that separated tourists from the guards' ceremonial area. "Hey everyone, I'm here at Buckingham Palace with these super serious guards who think they're too cool to acknowledge their fans," she said into her camera, her voice artificially bright and cheerful. "Let's see if we can get them to crack a smile, shall we?" Sarah and Jessica watched with amusement as their friend began her performance. They had no idea that Amanda's live stream was broadcasting their behavior to viewers around the world, many of whom were already expressing shock and disapproval in the rapidly scrolling comment section. Amanda started with what she considered harmless antics, waving enthusiastically at Sergeant Morrison while narrating her actions for her audience. "Look at this guy. He's like a robot or something. Hello there, handsome soldier boy. Can you give my followers a wave?" When the sergeant maintained his position without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement, Amanda interpreted his professionalism as a personal slight. Her followers were commenting frantically, with many trying to warn her that she was being disrespectful, but she was too focused on creating entertaining content to read the negative feedback. "Okay, he's playing hard to get," Amanda continued, moving closer to the barriers. "Maybe he needs a little more encouragement. What do you think, guys? Should I try to get his attention?" The comments section exploded with warnings and criticism, but Amanda's moderators quickly deleted the negative posts, leaving only the encouraging messages from her younger, less informed followers. This created a false sense of support that emboldened her to push even further. Jessica, seeing an opportunity to join the entertainment, stepped forward with her own phone. "This is perfect content for my legal blog," she said, beginning to record her own video. "I'm going to document how these government employees are failing to provide proper customer service to visiting Americans. This could be a great case study about international business relations." Sarah, not wanting to be left out of what she saw as harmless fun, began taking photos of herself posing provocatively near the guards. "These will be perfect for my social media," she said, completely oblivious to the fact that her behavior was being observed by palace security cameras and causing increasing concern among the staff. The three women were now creating a spectacle that was drawing attention from every corner of the courtyard. Tour guides were trying to redirect their groups away from the area. Parents were covering their children's ears to shield them from the women's increasingly crude comments. And even other tourists were beginning to pull out their phones to record the unfolding situation. Sergeant Morrison remained at his post, his training keeping him perfectly still despite the growing circus around him. However, his fellow guards were beginning to take notice of the disruption. The subtle communication system they had developed over years of service allowed them to alert each other to potential problems without breaking their ceremonial positions. Corporal Hayes, from his position near the palace entrance, could see the situation developing and began the discreet process of notifying the palace security team. A slight adjustment of his grip on his rifle sent a signal to the guard at the next position, who in turn passed the message along through the network of soldiers stationed around the complex. "Look, I think they're trying to communicate with each other," Amanda said excitedly into her camera, completely misunderstanding what she was witnessing. "They must be talking about us. Maybe they're finally going to interact with their fans." She began waving more frantically and calling out louder, trying to provoke any kind of response. "Come on, guys. Just one little smile for the camera. My followers are dying to see you break character." Jessica had moved to what she thought was a strategic position and was now filming while providing her own commentary. "As you can see, these public servants are refusing to acknowledge the citizens who ultimately pay their salaries through taxes. This is a clear example of government inefficiency and poor public relations." Her legal background had taught her to build cases through documentation, but she was completely misreading the situation. What she saw as evidence of poor service was actually evidence of exceptional discipline and professionalism under increasingly difficult circumstances. Sarah had discovered that she could get closer to the barriers by approaching from a different angle, and she was now taking increasingly bold photos while making loud comments about the guards' appearance. "They're actually kind of cute under all that gear," she announced. "I wonder what they look like out of uniform. Maybe I should ask for their numbers." The palace staff watching from their discreet positions were now in full alert mode. The women had crossed several lines of appropriate behavior, and their actions were being carefully documented. Protocol required them to allow the guards to handle the situation according to their training, but backup procedures were being quietly activated. Other tourists were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the spectacle. An elderly British gentleman approached the women and politely asked them to lower their voices and show more respect, but they dismissed him with contempt. "Mind your own business, Grandpa," Amanda snapped, barely looking away from her phone screen. "We're just having fun. Don't you have somewhere else to be?" The gentleman's face reddened with anger and embarrassment, but his wife gently guided him away from the confrontation. Their quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the women's brash behavior, highlighting just how far out of line the three visitors had become. As the morning wore on, the women's behavior became increasingly outrageous. They were now openly mocking not just the guards, but the entire tradition and culture they represented. What had started as thoughtless disrespect was evolving into a deliberate provocation that would soon demand a response from the very professionals they were mocking. The breaking point came when Amanda made a decision that would transform her from merely annoying to genuinely threatening in the eyes of palace security. Emboldened by what she perceived as the guards' helplessness and driven by the need to create increasingly dramatic content for her followers, she decided to cross the rope barrier that separated the public area from the guards' ceremonial space. "All right, everyone, we're going to the next level," she announced to her live stream, which now had over 50,000 viewers watching in real time. Many were commenting frantically, begging her to stop, but Amanda was reading only the encouraging messages from her core fan base who didn't understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. As Amanda stepped over the rope barrier, several things happened simultaneously. The tourists nearby gasped audibly, palace security personnel moved into more visible positions, and most importantly, Sergeant Morrison's training kicked into high gear. What the women had failed to understand was that these weren't just ceremonial figures in funny hats, but active military personnel sworn to protect the royal residence with their lives if necessary. The sergeant's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body was now coiled like a spring, ready to respond to what could potentially be interpreted as a security threat. His years of combat experience had taught him to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately, and a civilian breaching the security perimeter definitely qualified as a situation requiring response. "Oh my God, she actually did it!" Jessica exclaimed, rushing forward with her phone to capture every moment. This is going to be amazing content. Amanda, you're so brave. Sarah, caught up in the excitement and not wanting to miss out on what she saw as a once-in-a-lifetime photo opportunity, began encouraging Amanda to go even further. Get closer to him. Try to touch his uniform. Your followers will go crazy. What none of the women realized was that their behavior was being monitored by multiple layers of security personnel, both visible and invisible. Plainclothes officers, stationed throughout the tourist area, had been tracking their escalating behavior for the past 30 minutes, and their actions were being recorded by sophisticated surveillance systems that covered every inch of the palace grounds. Amanda, now, standing just feet away from Sergeant Morrison, began addressing him directly while continuing to film. So, what's your name, handsome? Don't worry, I won't tell anyone if you break your little soldier boy rules just this once. My followers would love to hear your voice. She reached out as if to touch his red tunic, and that action triggered an immediate response that she was completely unprepared for. Years of military training and protocol took over as Sergeant Morrison executed a perfect about-face, turning to look directly at Amanda with an expression that could have frozen fire. Stand back from the Queen's Guard. His voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of someone who had commanded troops in active combat zones. The power and suddenness of his response sent Amanda stumbling backward in shock, nearly dropping her phone in the process. The entire crowd of tourists fell silent, with many instinctively taking several steps away from the confrontation. Parents grabbed their children's hands, elderly visitors looked around nervously, and tour guides began quietly shepherding their groups toward exits. The playful atmosphere that had surrounded the women's antics evaporated instantly, replaced by a tension that everyone could feel. Back away from this area immediately, Sergeant Morrison continued, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was not making a request but issuing a command. You are in violation of security protocols and will comply with instructions. Immediately. Amanda's face went from flushed excitement to pale shock as she realized that her harmless fun had suddenly become something much more serious. Her live stream was now broadcasting her humiliation to thousands of viewers, many of whom were commenting with a mixture of satisfaction and secondhand embarrassment. I was just trying to get some content, she stammered, her usual confident demeanor completely shattered. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. Ignorance is not an excuse, the sergeant replied, his military bearing making it clear that he was not interested in explanations or apologies. Return to the public area now. Jessica, who had been so confident in her legal knowledge just moments before, suddenly realized that her understanding of American customer service expectations had no application in this situation. The guard's response had been so swift and authoritative that she found herself backing away without even consciously deciding to do so. Sarah, who had spent her entire adult life using her wealth and social position to avoid consequences for her behavior, was experiencing something completely foreign to her privileged existence. The sergeant's commanding presence made it clear that her usual tactics of intimidation and entitlement would have no effect whatsoever. As Amanda stumbled backward over the rope barrier, her phone still recording her humiliation, she bumped into Corporal Hayes, who had moved into position to provide backup for his colleague. The young corporal's presence served as a reminder that the guards operated as a coordinated unit, and that challenging one meant challenging them all. You will remain in the public area and conduct yourselves appropriately, Corporal Hayes added, his voice calm but carrying the same unmistakable authority as his sergeant's. Any further violations of security protocols will result in immediate removal from the premises. The three women found themselves surrounded by a semicircle of tourists who were now openly staring at them with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. What had started as an attempt to create entertaining content had backfired spectacularly, leaving them publicly humiliated and facing the possibility of more serious consequences. Amanda's livestream was now filled with comments mocking her retreat and praising the guards for their professional handling of the situation. Her follower count, which she obsessively monitored, was beginning to drop as viewers expressed their disgust with her disrespectful behavior. The guards returned to their ceremonial positions, but the atmosphere around them had changed completely. The other tourists now watched with renewed respect and appreciation for the professionalism and discipline they had just witnessed. The women's attempt to mock and belittle the guards had instead highlighted exactly why these men were worthy of the honor and respect their positions commanded. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation left the three women in a state of shock they had never experienced before. For people accustomed to being the center of attention for positive reasons, finding themselves the focus of universal disapproval was a completely foreign and deeply uncomfortable experience. Amanda's hands were visibly shaking as she tried to end her live stream, but the damage had already been done. The video of her humiliation was being screen recorded by dozens of viewers and would soon be circulating across social media platforms worldwide. Her carefully crafted image as a confident, fearless influencer had been shattered in a matter of seconds by a single command from a royal guard. "This is insane," she whispered to her companions, her usual loud bravado replaced by genuine fear. "My followers are going crazy in the comments. They're saying I disrespected the British military. Some of them are calling me a disgrace to America. My reputation is being destroyed in real time." Jessica, whose legal mind was finally beginning to grasp the seriousness of their situation, was frantically researching British laws on her phone. What she discovered made her stomach drop. Interfering with royal duties, threatening security at royal residences, and disturbing the peace were all serious offenses in the United Kingdom, potentially carrying heavy fines and even imprisonment for repeat offenders or those whose actions were deemed particularly egregious. "We need to leave immediately," Jessica said urgently to her friends. "I've been looking up the legal implications of what just happened, and we could be in serious trouble. The British legal system doesn't play games when it comes to royal security." Sarah, who had built her entire identity around being untouchable due to her family's wealth and connections, was experiencing a crisis of confidence. Her usual response to any challenge was to escalate the confrontation until the other party backed down. But the sergeant's commanding presence had made it clear that intimidation tactics would not work here. "This is ridiculous," she said. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. "I'm going to call the American embassy. These people can't treat American citizens this way. My father has connections in the State Department." As the women huddled together trying to figure out their next move, they became aware that other tourists were openly photographing and recording them. Their behavior had become such a spectacle that they were now the unofficial entertainment for everyone else at the palace. Phones were pointed in their direction from every angle, capturing their humiliation for posterity. A family from Germany approached them with obvious disapproval. The father, a distinguished man in his 60s, spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. These guards are heroes who have served their country in war. They deserve respect, not your childish behavior." His teenage daughter added, "We learned about the royal guards in school. They're not just for show. They're real soldiers who have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. How could you mock people who have risked their lives for their country?" The criticism from strangers was overwhelming for women who were used to being admired and catered to. Amanda found herself checking her phone obsessively, watching her follower count drop by the hundreds as news of her behavior spread across social media. Screenshots from her live stream were being shared with increasingly harsh commentary about American tourists and entitled influencers. Meanwhile, palace security personnel were conducting their own assessment of the situation. Chief Inspector Margaret Thornfield, a veteran of 25 years with the Metropolitan Police who specialized in royal protection, was reviewing the security footage from multiple angles. What she saw confirmed that while the women's behavior had been deeply inappropriate and potentially threatening, the guards had handled the situation perfectly within established protocols. The sergeant's response was textbook, she noted to her deputy while reviewing the footage. "Immediate, authoritative, and proportional to the threat level. The women clearly crossed security boundaries, but they appear to be stupid, rather than genuinely dangerous." However, Inspector Thornfield also recognized that the incident couldn't simply be ignored. The women's actions had disrupted royal ceremonies, potentially endangered security operations, and demonstrated a level of disrespect that demanded some form of official response. The question was determining the appropriate level of that response. As word of the incident spread through the palace administrative offices, it reached the attention of Sir Charles Whitmore, the master of the royal household. Sir Charles had spent 30 years managing protocol and public relations for the royal family, and he understood that incidents like this needed to be addressed swiftly and definitively to prevent them from becoming precedents for other badly behaved tourists. Prepare a formal complaint to be filed with the appropriate authorities, Sir Charles instructed his staff. These women's behavior was unacceptable, and there need to be consequences. However, we should also ensure that the positive aspects of this incident are highlighted. Our guards demonstrated exactly the kind of professionalism and discipline that makes them respected worldwide. Back in the courtyard, the three women were beginning to understand that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their immediate embarrassment. Other tourists continued to approach them with criticism. Palace staff members were taking careful note of their presence, and Amanda's social media notifications were becoming increasingly hostile. "I think we should go back to the hotel," Amanda said quietly, her usual confidence completely deflated. "I need to figure out how to handle the damage control on this. My management team is probably freaking out right now." Jessica nodded in agreement, still scrolling through legal websites on her phone. "We definitely need to leave. I'm seeing articles online that are already calling this the Royal Guard incident. This is going to follow us for years." Sarah, despite her family's wealth and connections, was beginning to realize that money and influence had their limits when it came to international incidents involving military personnel and royal security. The guards' response had been so swift and professional that there was no room to claim they had been treated unfairly or inappropriately. As they began to make their way toward the exit, the three women noticed that the other tourists were parting before them like a sea, nobody wanting to be associated with their disgraceful behavior. The respectful silence that had fallen over the crowd after the sergeant's command remained in effect, creating an atmosphere of solemn appreciation for the guards' professionalism. The royal guards had returned to their ceremonial positions, but their alert bearing made it clear that they remained fully aware of the women's presence and would respond instantly to any further inappropriate behavior. Their silent vigilance served as a reminder that respect for tradition and authority wasn't negotiable, regardless of where the visitors came from or how entitled they felt. The women's attempt to quietly leave the palace grounds was thwarted when they discovered that their behavior had attracted the attention of more than just disapproving tourists. As they approached the main exit, two uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Police were waiting for them, their presence making it clear that the incident had escalated beyond a simple tourist mishap. Constable David Richardson, a 20-year veteran of the force who specialized in incidents involving royal properties, stepped forward with his notebook ready. His partner, Constable Sarah Murphy, positioned herself strategically to ensure that the women couldn't simply walk away from the situation. "Excuse me, ladies," Constable Richardson said, in the polite but firm tone that British police officers had perfected over generations. "We'd like to have a word with you about the incident that occurred here this morning. We've received reports of behavior that may constitute a breach of public order and interference with royal duties." Amanda's face went white as she realized that her social media stunt was about to have real legal consequences. The confidence that had carried her through years of online controversies evaporated completely when faced with actual police officers, who clearly took their duties seriously. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We're just American tourists trying to enjoy our vacation. We didn't mean any harm." Constable Murphy consulted her own notes before responding. "According to multiple witness statements and security footage, one of you crossed the security barrier around the Queen's Guard, refused initial requests to maintain appropriate distance, and continued disruptive behavior, even after being warned by palace staff." Jessica's legal training kicked in, but she quickly realized that her knowledge of American law provided little guidance for dealing with British authorities in matters involving royal security. "What exactly are we being accused of? Do we need to contact our embassy?" "You're not being accused of anything at this time," Constable Richardson replied. "However, we are conducting an official investigation into potential violations of the Royal and Parliamentary Security Act, as well as possible charges related to disorderly conduct and harassment of military personnel in the course of their duties." Sarah, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally found her voice. This is absolutely ridiculous. We're American citizens and we have rights. You can't intimidate us just because your little toy soldiers got their feelings hurt. The constable's expression hardened at Sarah's continued disrespect.
Madam, the Royal Guards are decorated military veterans who have served with distinction in combat zones around the world. Your behavior toward them has been documented by multiple sources and will be evaluated according to British law, regardless
of your nationality. As the police interview continued, a growing crowd of onlookers gathered at a respectful distance. Many were tourists who had witnessed the original incident and were now fascinated to see its aftermath. Others were local residents who had heard about the confrontation and come to see the famous entitled Americans who had dared to disrespect the Royal Guards. Amanda's phone, which she had been clutching like a lifeline throughout the ordeal, began buzzing incessantly with notifications. Her management team, publicists, and business partners were all trying to reach her as news of the incident spread across social media platforms. Screenshots and video clips from her live stream were being shared millions of times, accompanied by increasingly harsh commentary about her behavior. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide your passport and current address in London," Constable Murphy said to Amanda. "We'll also need contact information for your legal representation if you choose to retain counsel." The reality of potentially needing a lawyer in a foreign country was beginning to sink in for all three women. What had started as a morning of casual sightseeing had transformed into an international incident that could have serious legal and financial consequences for years to come. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Sir Charles Whitmore was meeting with senior palace staff to determine the appropriate response to the incident. The consensus was clear. While the women's behavior had been inappropriate and disruptive, the guards had handled the situation perfectly, and the incident actually served to highlight the professionalism and discipline of the royal security apparatus. "We should prepare a statement praising our guards' exemplary conduct," Sir Charles decided. "This incident demonstrates exactly why these men are held in such high regard. Their response was swift, appropriate, and maintained the dignity of the institution while ensuring security was not compromised." The palace's public relations team was already fielding calls from news organizations around the world. The story was being picked up by major media outlets, with headlines focusing on the guards' professional response rather than the women's inappropriate behavior. This was exactly the kind of positive coverage that the royal household valued most. As the police interview continued, it became clear that the women would face formal consequences for their actions. While criminal charges were unlikely for first-time offenders, they would receive official warnings that would remain on record and could affect future travel to the United Kingdom. "You'll each be receiving a formal caution," Constable Richardson explained. "This will be recorded in our system and may impact any future applications for visas or entry to the UK. Additionally, you're being banned from all royal properties for the remainder of your stay in London." The ban meant that their carefully planned itinerary, which included visits to several other royal sites, would have to be completely restructured. More importantly, it served as a permanent reminder that their behavior had been serious enough to warrant official sanction. Amanda realized that her influencer career, built on projecting confidence and fearlessness, had been seriously damaged by a single morning's poor decisions. The video of her backing away from the Royal Guard would likely haunt her online presence for years to come. Jessica understood that as a practicing attorney, having any kind of official warning from foreign law enforcement could complicate her professional standing and potentially affect her ability to represent clients in international matters. Sarah was beginning to comprehend that her family's money and connections couldn't protect her from the consequences of disrespecting foreign military personnel and national institutions. The three women who had started their day feeling entitled to special treatment were ending it with official police warnings, lifetime bans from royal properties, and the knowledge that their behavior had been broadcast to millions of people worldwide. The royal guards they had mocked stood as proud and dignified as ever, their professionalism having been validated in the most public way possible. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the consequences of that fateful morning continued to ripple through the lives of all three women in ways they never could have imagined. What had seemed like a harmless bit of fun had evolved into a cautionary tale that followed them across continents and careers. Amanda's influencer empire had crumbled almost overnight. The video of her humiliating retreat from the Royal Guard had become one of the most shared clips of the year, spawning countless memes and reaction videos. Her follower count, once her primary source of pride and income, had plummeted from over 2 million to barely 300,000, and most of those remaining seemed to follow her just to mock her latest posts. Major brands that had once competed for her endorsement had quietly terminated their contracts, unwilling to be associated with someone who had become synonymous with entitled American tourist behavior. Her management team had dropped her within a week of the incident, and her attempts to rebrand herself as a reformed influencer had fallen flat with audiences who couldn't forget her disrespectful behavior. "I've applied to over 50 companies for regular jobs," Amanda confided to her therapist during one of their weekly sessions. "But as soon as they Google my name, that video shows up. I'm basically unemployable in any field that requires public interaction. 6 months ago, I was making 6 figures a month from social media. Now I'm working part-time at a coffee shop where I have to wear a hat and sunglasses to avoid being recognized." The psychological impact had been devastating for someone whose entire identity had been built around online validation and admiration. Amanda was learning to cope with anonymity and insignificance for the first time in her adult life, a process that required rebuilding her sense of self-worth from the ground up. Jessica's legal career had suffered similarly dramatic consequences, though they were more subtle and professional in nature. Word of her involvement in the Royal Guard incident had spread quickly through legal circles, particularly among attorneys who specialized in international law. Her credibility had been seriously undermined by her demonstrated ignorance of British legal protocols and her arrogant assumption that American legal principles applied universally. Several high-profile clients had quietly terminated their relationships, with her firm expressing concerns about her judgment and cultural sensitivity. Her partners had initially tried to weather the storm, but as potential clients began specifically requesting other attorneys, it became clear that Jessica's presence was affecting the firm's reputation and bottom line. "We think it would be best for everyone if you took an extended sabbatical," the senior partner had told her just 3 months after the incident. "Perhaps some time away from high-visibility cases would allow this situation to blow over. We have clients specifically asking not to work with you, and that's not sustainable for the firm." Jessica had been forced to take a leave of absence that everyone knew was really a polite termination. Her attempts to find positions at other prestigious firms had been unsuccessful, as news of her involvement in the incident had spread throughout the legal community. She was now working as a solo practitioner, handling small claims and minor disputes that were far beneath her previous standards. "I spent 15 years building my reputation," she told her former mentor over coffee. "All of it destroyed by one morning of stupidity. I keep replaying that day, wondering what I was thinking. How could I have been so arrogant and ignorant about basic respect for other cultures?" Sarah's consequences were perhaps the most far-reaching of all, despite her family's wealth and connections. The incident had occurred during a particularly sensitive time in her father's business dealings, which involved several major contracts with British companies. When footage of his daughter's disrespectful behavior toward British military personnel began circulating, it created diplomatic embarrassment that threatened millions of dollars in international business relationships. "Your little stunt in London has cost us the Henderson contract," her father had informed her during a tense family meeting. "That's $40 million in lost revenue because our British partners don't want to be associated with a family that disrespects their military traditions. The board is questioning my judgment for not controlling my own daughter's behavior." The family's social standing in their exclusive New York circles had also suffered. Country club memberships had been quietly revoked, charity board positions had been withdrawn, and longtime family friends had begun declining invitations to social gatherings. Sarah discovered that even immense wealth couldn't purchase forgiveness for behavior that violated fundamental principles of respect and decency. Her trust fund had been frozen pending completion of a comprehensive course in cultural sensitivity and international etiquette, a requirement her father had imposed to prevent further embarrassing incidents. For the first time in her life, Sarah was learning to live within a budget and work for her own income. experiences that were forcing her to confront the bubble of privilege that had previously protected her from consequences. Meanwhile, the royal guards who had been the targets of their disrespect had become unlikely celebrities in their own right. Sergeant Morrison and Corporal Hayes were featured in a documentary about military discipline and tradition that won several international awards. Their professional handling of the incident had become a case study in military academies around the world, demonstrating how proper training and respect for duty could turn a potentially volatile situation into a teachable moment. It's strange to think that their attempt to humiliate us actually ended up highlighting everything we stand for, Sergeant Morrison reflected during an interview for a military magazine. Discipline, honor, respect for tradition, and professionalism. Under pressure, they tried to make us look foolish, but instead they demonstrated exactly why these values matter. The sergeant had received commendations from his superiors and had been invited to speak at several military events about maintaining composure under difficult circumstances. His response to the women's provocation had become legendary within military circles, a perfect example of how to handle disrespectful civilians while maintaining both dignity and authority. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the individuals involved. Tourism authorities in London began incorporating the story into their cultural orientation materials, using it as an example of appropriate behavior expectations for international visitors. The incident had sparked conversations about respect for military service members and cultural traditions that resonated with people around the world. Social media platforms began using the incident as a case study in how quickly online behavior could have real-world consequences. Amanda's experience became a cautionary tale taught in digital marketing courses and social media training programs, demonstrating how a single poor decision could destroy years of carefully built online presence. The three women, once so confident in their superiority and entitlement, had learned harsh lessons about respect, consequences, and the limits of privilege. Their morning of mocking the royal guards had become a permanent reminder that some institutions and traditions command respect, regardless of one's personal opinions or social status. As the anniversary of the incident approached, each woman was still dealing with its aftermath in their own way. Amanda was slowly rebuilding her life with a new understanding of humility and respect. Jessica was working to restore her legal career while serving pro bono clients to demonstrate her renewed commitment to justice and service. Sarah was learning to navigate the world without the cushion of unlimited wealth, discovering strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. The royal guards continued their duties with the same dignity and professionalism they had always shown, their reputation enhanced rather than diminished by their encounter with three entitled women who had learned too late that respect is earned through behavior, not demanded through privilege. Their silent vigilance remained a symbol of honor and tradition that no amount of mockery could diminish.